Nations will be making those votes as to who will be taking those particular seats. Sarah, let's start off with you, seeing that even earlier on this year, including last year, Kenya has been arguing that the campaign that has been put on by Djibouti is dishonorable. There's also been a meeting with the AU. Why is it that Djibouti is still pushing ahead? Okay, we seem to have a problem with your line there, Sarah. Let's just quickly go to Sherwin, Bryce-Pease in the meantime. Sherwin, good evening and welcome to African Perspective. Just quickly paint us a picture of what is currently happening at the moment.
Well, not very much, Aldrin, to be quite frank. This morning, early at about 9 a.m. Local time, elections began, but it was a different format of elections because of the COVID-19 pandemic that is still prevalent around the world and here in New York. So you didn't have a general assembly of all 193 member states and all, multiple people in each delegation filling the hall, for which is really one of the highlights of the annual General Assembly session to vote for the new 5 non-permanent seats on the Security Council. You had an empty General Assembly hall for most of the voting that happened this morning, and through a staggered process, member states were allowed to come and cast their ballots, check in at the front desk with a big glass screen, go in and vote alone, and then exit the hall before the next delegation could go in. But essentially, we are now waiting for those results to be tabulated. I have a screen to my left that has a live feed from the General Assembly. It's blue at the moment. We're waiting for the President of the General Assembly to come out and of course, I can tell you who's running. You've had a discussion about Djibouti and Kenya. They are vying to replace the African seat that will be vacated by South Africa on December 31st this year after serving 2 years in the non-permanent capacity. Canada, Ireland and Norway are vying for the regional group called the Western European and Others Group, a really tight race between Canada, Ireland and Norway there. And then you have clean slates. Latin America, the only country running for Latin America is Mexico. They will replace the Dominican Republic, and India is running unopposed for the Asia-Pacific group. They will replace Indonesia in the council. And of course, you correctly point out that were Djibouti to win, you'd have 3 French-speaking countries in the council, namely Tunisia, Niger and Djibouti. But as your analyst was pointing out, Kenya really a favorite here, given this debatable African Union endorsement that really is letting the feathers out of the coop, if you will, in terms of Africa not running on a clean slate this year.
And Djibouti goes into this contest, of course, on the back foot, considering that even with the African Union split, it was 37 for Kenya and 13 for Djibouti. But then the question is that whether Kenya will be able to convince the other member states, or at least 129 member states, that it is the rightful country to take on that seat and replace South Africa. And also on top of that, considering the picture that you've just painted, because when we speak about the United Nations, we also speak about lobbying. So in the absence of lobbying as we used to it, what does this mean for this particular contest?
Well, look, Kenya is vying for a non-permanent seat. And I think if you speak to diplomats and delegates from any of the non-permanent 10 elected members in the council, they will tell you how difficult it is. As much as you talk about how Kenya will have greater influence than Djibouti, or this one is better than that, they are still non-permanent members, and their power is very limited in the current dynamics in the Security Council. You have the big powers, the permanent 5, particularly the United States, particularly Russia and China, dominating the geopolitical sway that you often don't see the ability and the dexterity of the Security Council to resolve some of the issues facing this body that is responsible for the maintenance of peace and security around the world. If you look at particularly South Africa's role vis-a-vis Libya, they came in with a lot of energy to rectify the situation in Libya, and to this day they have struggled to use their influence to bring bring this council around a consensus to bring peace to Libya. In fact, the most recent iteration of this was the Secretary General's appeal, given the COVID-19 pandemic, appealing to the world for a global ceasefire of all conflicts around the world. And where did that go? You didn't hear an endorsement from the UN Security Council. They got close, but one country stood in the way of an adoption of a resolution. So these are the dynamics that these countries, as much as they posture themselves as being able to do certain things, the reality on the ground is you need to reform the Security Council, because the big five dominate here and the 10 really just make up the numbers by and large.
And the argument has been that considering that most of the United Nations Security Council's operations are on the continent, about 75% of the United Nations Security Council agenda on the continent. But let's just quickly bring in Saraha Kimani again. Saraha, the question that I had earlier on is that Kenya has made representation to the African Union again, calling on the African Union to ensure that only Kenya contests that particular seat. However, though, that hasn't happened. What does this mean for the geopolitical tension in East Africa?
Well, this will only increase the tension between countries in the IGAD region, considering that both Kenya and Djibouti are members of the IGAD region. But Kenya started its campaign quite early and even got the endorsement of at least 37 member states of the African Union in February, while Djibouti only got 13. But in all this, Djibouti has insisted that the vote should have actually been taken to the UN Security Council, and that there should not have been any prior voting before that. However, Kenya is arguing that always there has been an endorsement ahead of the main vote, and that they should have gone to the vote as one, with one voice, and that one voice should have been the voice of supporting Kenya. Kenya is, of course, trying to use her muscle as a regional economic giant, also as a regional political giant, in terms of whether it is its centrality in the region, whether it is its seat being the center and the headquarters of the United Nations, whether it is its position in terms of peace building across the region, in Somalia, in South Sudan, in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So it is using all that. Indeed, President Kenyatta using this forum or this vote as a vote for peacekeeping and a vote for a country that has been stable all this time.
And considering the words that have been used, for instance, Saraha, you have Djibouti arguing that what has happened with the African Union in voting and supporting Kenya to take up that seat is that it was, quote, illegal. And on the other end, you have Kenya saying that what Djibouti is doing is dishonorable. What does this mean?
Well, we hope, and President Kenyatta has said that after this, both Djibouti and Kenya will continue to be friendly neighbors, and they will continue to work together. A lot of people, including political analysts and international experts, saying that they hope that the relations between the two countries will be mended and that they will not fracture so much so that it will affect the geopolitics of the region, and especially in terms of peace building, because both Djibouti and Kenya are leading peace-building efforts in Somalia and also in Ethiopia, in areas that have been affected by conflict in Ethiopia. And so they are hoping that once this is done and whoever wins, then the two countries will still be able to work together for the betterment, not just of the region, but also of the continent.
But I wonder then, Sherwin, and just in the nature of geopolitics as well, that once there is this tension that has built up, what happens to the issue around trust amongst the member states?
Look, the UN is a body that really pushes consensus. So, politics aside, you run an election. This is a competitive election, and may the best man win. I mean, you see this in national elections. You will see this among diplomats at the United Nations in the Security Council. They tend to be friends outside of the chamber. They take their country positions when they, go in and have to defend national positions in the United Nations. I just want to give you a little bit of background to Djibouti's position. A note verbal, which is kind of a formal government communication, was issued to African member states at the UN earlier this week by the African Union Permanent Mission to the United Nations. I have a letter from Djibouti responding to that note verbal. Basically, Djibouti saying saying that they reject the affirmation that the African Union endorsed Kenya as the African candidate. The letter continues. The Republic of Djibouti, with the support of many fellow African countries, openly and vigorously challenged the validity of the deeply flawed outcome of the AU Permanent Representatives Committee process in August of 2019. The AU Executive Council, which is essentially the ministerial arm of the African Union, their decision, Djibouti says, not to endorse the 2019 recommendation of the AU Permanent Representatives Council, a committee the recommendation of the AUPRC evidently makes the recommendation by this committee to endorse Kenya for the African Group's 2021-22 non-permanent UN Security Council seat clearly illegitimate and void. So that's the dispute. They believe that the AU Permanent Representative Committee did not have the authority that, for example, an Executive Council or the heads of state plenary of the AU would have in endorsing a candidate for the council.
Considering that strong language that has been used, and just listening to what Saraha was saying earlier on, she sounds a bit more hopeful that there will be reconciliation between the two countries. But considering the statement that you've just read now, how easy would it be to get back there?
I don't think very difficult, as I've pointed out. You know, once these elections come up, it will have been a democratic process. And we should really not be frowning at the fact that you have a competitive slate. A lot of human rights groups, among them Human Rights Watch, Amnesty International, have long questioned this growing favor, this growing move towards having clean slates. You see Mexico and India running on a clean slate. South Africa, too, when it was a candidate, also ran on a clean slate. So what's the point of having an election where there's no competition? So, in the past, historically, you had multiple countries running for a single seat, and that made it much more interesting. This notion that we should normalize the idea that you have to have clean slates for every seat really is something that's been happening in the last decade and is still frowned upon at the UN. So I wouldn't see this too much in an objectionable way. This is healthy democracy at play. Let the best man win, Aldrin.
Healthy democracy, but for me, it's just the choice of words. Okay, Sarah, quickly before we wrap up.
Well, I wanted to come in and say one of the other selling points for Kenya and what Kenya has done to try and win over her other member states' compatriots is that Kenya is running on the basis of saying that when we come in, we will be pushing for reforms at the UN to ensure that the African continent gets a permanent seat. And so these are some of the things that are endearing member states. And considering they saw Kenya during the clamor of getting other member states to move out of the ICC, the muscle that it was able to marshal at that time, they are hoping that this time, if Kenya gets in, then indeed it will push for reforms at the UN Security Council. Okay.
Sherwin, what time should we know what the results are?
I was supposed to have them already, but they haven't come back. So the next few minutes.
The next few minutes. Thank you so much. Sherwin Bryce-Pease. And probably in the next few minutes, we'll break that story on The Globe. So coming up, as I've indicated, it is our sister program, The Globe, now at 10 o'clock. We'll also have the Director General of the WHO, Dr. Tedros Ghebreyesus, who says that United Nations and other countries who have raised concerns on how the WHO has handled COVID-19 outbreak in China must wait for the review panel report. The report will look at how this matter has been handled and reported to member countries. Recently, the United States President Donald Trump criticized the WHO, announcing the withdrawal of US from the organization. He said that the US wasn't happy with the WHO and China's handling of the COVID-19 pandemic. Dr. Tedros spoke exclusively to SABC News. Stay tuned for that exclusive interview right now, just after this on The Globe. Thank you so much for joining. African Perspective has come to an end. See you again next week. Goodbye.